Coming up on this edition of the Black Vault Radio, author and journalist Alex Hollings steps into the vault. As debates rage throughout American society on whether or not Donald Trump colluded with Russia to get elected, Alex focuses on the bigger picture. The fact that Russia even has the capability to do it at all. He explores a long history of foreign psychological influence and how it shapes global conflict.
Russia benefits from having a massive media infrastructure that they have put together and really managed to trick the United States, a large portion of the populace, into thinking they're legitimate news organizations. In today's world, it's more dangerous than ever, only because of how easy it is to gain access to people's heads. You need to understand that what they're telling you is probably bull. The other political party, if you're a conservative, shouldn't be the enemy.
Yeah.
They should be people on your team with different views.
All that and much more. So stay tuned. The Black Vault Radio is about to begin. More than 20 years ago, I began a journey. My quest for the truth. My name is John Greenewald, and I have hammered the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests trying to get answers. I have more than 2 million pages of declassified documents for you to download at theblackvault.com. Now, I attempt to dive even deeper and talk to some of the most brilliant minds on this planet. No government secret is off limits, and no question is off the table. All I aim for is the truth. This is the Black Vault Radio. That's right, everybody. This is the Black Vault Radio. I am your host, John Greenewald Jr. As always, thank you so much for making this your podcast and radio show of choice, at least for the next hour and a half or so anyway. I know there's a lot of options out there. I know that I had a couple week off here of not posting a show, quite simply. I had a little bit of a technical issue. I did a small upgrade, and by small, I mean a fairly major one here for myself. Kind of treated my other business, and here is a shameless plug. A couple years ago, I started a business here at home with the intent just to make a couple extra dollars. My goal was to pay for my son's daycare bill. Obviously, I have a daughter now as well who is a little past 3 months, but that was ultimately my goal. I'm pretty proud to say that actually took off, and I have kind of stopped working as a television producer and writer, just simply because that is now my full-time gig. I love working for myself. I work about 60, 70 hours a week, but that's okay. My boss is a little bit of a jerk, but hey, I have a lot of fun with it. The reason I gave that shameless plug there was the business kind of outgrew the computer that I had. Well, what's cool is the Black Vault benefits from that as well. The business that I run was is lowcostearbuds.com. I specialize in supplying low-cost headphones and earbuds to places like schools and hospitals and museums. Well, I needed a little bit more power on my computer and bought a Dell system. It sat here through the holidays not plugged in. I upgraded to have a couple monitors. Now here's why I'm telling you this long, boring story. Once I plugged everything in about the first to second week of January, nothing worked. The ultimate diagnosis by Dell was that the video card that I purchased in combination with the motherboard that I purchased conflicted with each other. That made almost nothing work. Now, it took hours to transfer 1.7 million files from one system to another. Now, those files do not include the files that are on the Black Vault website, if you could believe it. Those are just files that I work with, graphics files, audio files, music files for the Black Vault Radio, so on and so forth. 1.7 million files got transferred over and nothing worked. And I had a business to run away from the Black Vault, so it was panic time. Well, To summarize the story, obviously, I am back. Finally got everything back up and running. Thanks to Dell's support, they were very, very accommodating. Although the situation was very frustrating, they did actually send multiple technicians to my house over the course of a few days, brought a brand new video card of a different brand and model, but comparable to what I had purchased, to see if that would help, and it did. So that's why they determined it was a conflict, and voila, here I am broadcasting again. Thank you all for your patience. I really do appreciate that. But that is my long-winded apology for that short break. That radio show last that you heard with the creator, David O'Leary, the creator of Project Blue Book, the series on History Channel. I actually recorded that a couple months ago. They embargoed my interview until just before the interview start date, and I definitely, definitely followed what the A&E network marketing people asked me, and dropped the interview then. But my computer was in shambles at that point, hence the couple weeks of trying to rebuild everything, get all the software back installed. But here I am. We're back. The guest today, Alex Hollings. He is the author of The Perception Wars, How Influence Shapes Conflict. It's a fascinating topic, one I don't know pretty much anything about, so I'm looking forward to picking his brain. Now, before he comes on, I want to talk to you a little bit about what happened. I know some of you are very curious, for those who have followed me on social networking and saw my post here recently that I was in quote-unquote Facebook jail. Now, here is what happened on what landed me in Facebook jail. I was originally going to do this as more of a written statement. Then I realized I'm playing with fire because I don't know what quote-unquote violation that would be, and my account is now flagged that if I violate anything else, I will be banned for at least a month, if not indefinitely. Now, I don't post many things that are that off the wall. I don't cuss, at least not much. I don't do things other than primarily post the government documents that I received. So why did I get in trouble? Well, 6+ years ago, I posted something about the Newtown school massacre. I do not support the whole false flag theory on this. I do not believe those crazy conspiracy theories about crisis actors. Here was what the post was. It was a photograph of people claiming those wild conspiracy theories and claiming that some of the parents were crisis actors, and I spoke out against it. I said, no, that we cannot do this to every tragedy. Not everything is a conspiracy. I supported at the time the rights for the parents to come out and talk without being ridiculed by the crazy conspiracy community out there. I was not supporting it. But since I put a photograph that people were disseminating, and again, speaking out against it, my account was flagged. Now, I logged in and I was like, I didn't post this. And then I remembered this was 6 years ago. And I thought, wow, they're really digging deep here, but I didn't think anything of it. And I wasn't banned or suspended. I let it go. Well, fast forward then about 3 days after that, I get another warning that popped up when I logged into Facebook. This time, it was a posting of a public record document, also connected to that school shooting, of the school shooter. I received, under the Freedom of Information Act, not leaked, not rumored, not fabricated, but I received, under the Freedom of Information Act, the death certificate of Adam Lanza, the school shooter, the crazy psychopath that went into Newtown and shot the school up and killed innocent children and teachers. Now, the guy was a raging lunatic. I had gone after documents based on a rumor that there were multiple certificates. That actually turned out to be true. There were multiple death certificates with different dates for Adam Lanza. I don't see a conspiracy in this, but I posted the documents because, well, I post everything that I get under the Freedom of Information Act. It had the Social Security Administration headline. I got the notice of death from them. Then I got a second one because the first had his date of death 1 day prior to the shooting. The next document came that was his actual date of death, which was the date of the shooting. Now, I did not insinuate that this was proof of anything other than report my findings and confirm the rumor that there were 2 certificates out there. That in itself violated the rights of that psychopath, Adam Lanza. I somehow tarnished his image by posting those documents and a photo that was widely circulated by the mainstream media. This was not anything inappropriate or violating any rules. This was essentially a mugshot. I mean, it looked like a mugshot. It wasn't, but it was his school photo. The guy looked like a psychopath, in addition to actually being one. But apparently me posting a public record tarnished the image of a dead psychopath who shot up a school. That upset Facebook, and they put me in Facebook jail. I was banned from the site. I couldn't post. I couldn't communicate with the 50,000 plus followers that follow my research and work and postings on Facebook. And I had to resort to tweeting out what had happened. So for those that are following me on Twitter, and I hope you now do so if you do not, that's not a shameless ploy to try and get you to, follow me there as well. But my whole point is I am getting in trouble for not making crazy accusations, for not making crazy conspiracy theories, for not posting leaked documents, for not fabricating documents. I got in trouble for posting a real document. There was no conspiracy theory that went along with it. It was simply a real document. That is what caused Facebook to ban me. Now, why am I making such a big deal out of this? Well, to my surprise, irony, stick my foot in my mouth, whatever you want to say about it, I have spoken out on this very program in support of Facebook banning those who are circulating those wild conspiracy theories. I have said, and I do still stand by this, even though I don't want to, I stand by that is their site. They can make up the rules whether we like it or not. But now I find myself banned for not doing what I have supported in the past, and that was banning people for these wild and not only wild conspiracy theories, but hurtful and damaging conspiracy theories. Now, for posting real documents, I am in that same category that I have supported the banning of. Somehow Facebook puts me in that category and I'm flagged. Now, at this point, as I speak to you anyway, I am okay to go back on Facebook and post. So the ban has been lifted. But my account is flagged that if I do this again or something like it or anything that, Facebook deems as inappropriate or violating their rules or whatever, I'm done for at least a month, if not more. So that's why I'm putting out the story to you on how ridiculous our society has become, that in itself is a violation of their terms of use. Now, they have a right to do it. Yeah, I'm going to stand by what I said in the past. I don't want to. I want to complain and, put my arms in the air about free speech and all that. But I will stand by what I've said in the past. But I will say this. If posting public records is now what a major outlet is deeming as inappropriate, or if by quote unquote violating the image of Adam Lanza, the psychopath school shooter, that apparently I tarnished his image or I spoke out against him and that was somehow a bad thing. If that is who we have become as a society, that major sites like Facebook is banning people like me for posting those documents, I'm a little worried at this point and saddened that is what we have become. Do they have a right? Unfortunately, I'll stand by what I said and say yes. Do I agree with it? At this point, not anymore, because they have crossed the line and they have really hurt the ability to get the truth to the people. Again, not the crazy conspiracy theories. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about documents that I can show you so you can make up your own mind with no editorial attached. Maybe a question like, hey, why did this happen? But I don't say this means that or this means this. I don't say that. I put the documents out there for you to make your own decision, and somehow that is a violation. So make sure that you do follow the Black Vault on as many social media channels as you can. Again, not a ploy by me to get you to do so, but rather, if I do somehow find myself in violation, I'm gone. So those 50,000 followers, if you don't have another way to keep tabs on me, you won't know what happened. And I don't want that to happen to all of us. So please make sure that you do follow that. And also what's scary is they're digging into at least 6 years ago. They expect us all to go through our 6+ years of posting, 7 years of posting. I think I've been on Facebook for 10, but I could be wrong on that. The time that it would take to go through every post to make sure that I don't violate it's just not achievable unless I just delete everything and start over, which I'm not going to do. So we'll see what happens. I have no idea how this is going to play out. But what's interesting is I have a feeling that situation may play a role in the topic with my guest today, Mr. Alex Hollings, again, the author of The Perception Wars, How Influence Shapes Conflict. And that is all about how we, as the general public, receive our information. Is it tainted? Is it real? Is it slanted? Is it biased? Is that also then bleeding over into the political arena? How countries are trying to infiltrate other governments psychologically and mentally, other general publics of, let's say, the American people, and to inject ideas, to manipulate elections. I have a feeling some of this may come up. That is next on the TBV Dialogue segment with Mr. Alex Hollings. Stay tuned. He's coming right up. On this episode's TBV Dialogue segment, I welcome author and journalist Mr. Alex Hollings. A veteran of the United States Marine Corps, Alex writes on an array of subjects dealing with national security and foreign policy. Recently, he published The Perception Wars, How Influence Shapes Conflict, and his work is featured throughout many websites, including thenewsrep.com, where he serves as senior staff writer, Popular Mechanics, The Loadout Room, and he's the editor of FighterSweep.com, and you can find him in many other places as well. Alex, welcome to the Black Vault Radio.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me on, man. I'm excited to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. I'm excited about this show just simply because I don't know a whole lot about the research that you have done and the angles that you take, meaning I don't know the extent of how foreign influence in, let's say, elections and stuff like that really does play a role. And obviously you have done a lot of research on that. It's something that we hear about in the media, but it sounds like reading what you have researched, it goes much deeper than what we have heard about. So why don't you tell my listeners, and me included, what is kind of the brief overview of your book and what did you explore?
Well, I found my way into researching propaganda and influence, and narrative is a key word here. Honestly, through academics. When I was in grad school, I was going to school for communications with an emphasis in marketing. And I didn't really necessarily know what I was going to do with it. About halfway through grad school, I started pursuing writing as a career and found my way into foreign policy. And I quickly found that nation-level propaganda efforts really closely mirror like 101 level marketing efforts. Here in the United States, the idea of narrative and perception has really become politically polarizing after the 2016 presidential election. That's when people started really paying attention. But this is an issue of concern for national security and, just general security that dates back as long as there's been messaging. Just about any time that you receive a message, whether it's, through the internet, through the television, radio, all messaging comes with motive. The motive isn't always overt. The motive isn't always intentional, but the motive is always present. And that's really important in today's day and age when looking at our media, because a lot of media does come ripe with bias. But it's also really important in today's day and age when it comes to looking at the things you find online, especially. Foreign nations, Russia is an example that comes to mind, but China, maybe even more effectively, are really, really good at persuading you to feel a certain way about their nations or about their national endeavors. And the internet has provided them with a channel to reach you directly. Previous propaganda efforts had to go through mainstream media outlets, or they had to go through other broad-reaching means. But now in the digital age, they can find a list of the things that you're interested in. They can find a list of the things that you respond to, and you could tailor make messages to help persuade people to feel a certain way about a certain thing. In today's world, that's really, really important because people are more politically involved now, I'd argue, than they were 10 years ago.
And I just want to jump in because you had brought up the 2016 election, and I want to say that's, I think, where people know the quote unquote know the most about it, and they politicize this. But Absolutely. You, in many areas that I've seen in your writing, call this a war. Now, I want to start with the 2016 thing because that's what people relate to the most right now, and then we'll branch out. But tell me a little bit of is this kind of a political thing, a right side of the aisle versus the left side, and did Donald Trump do X, Y, and Z? Or does this go much, much deeper in foreign influence, and how scary that really is? Because you do call it a war.
It absolutely is. And you hit the nail on the head. When we talk about this right versus left partisan warfare that we're really getting entrenched in here in the United States, I would argue, obviously, elements of that have existed all along. The first newspapers published in the United States were fiercely partisan. At that time, the idea of objective journalism hadn't really matured quite yet. So there's a long history of partisan bickering in the U.S. I don't want to act as though that's new. But the idea that Russian manipulation of the 2016 election, as a great example, the idea that was meant to help Donald Trump get elected is probably the most successful aspect of the Russian influence campaign. They did indeed put forth a concerted effort to try to bolster Donald Trump's chances at getting elected. But the real end goal, the real objective, was to sow the seeds of discord within the United States. The intent was less about getting one candidate elected over the other. Granted, it was feasible that Donald Trump would benefit Russia over Hillary Clinton in office when it comes to sanctions and things like that. But far more valuable is the state of American politics today. Russia's watching us tear each other apart. We're much more interested in going to war with one another than we are with going to war with real threats looming on the horizon. Last year there was a poll that went out that found that Nancy Pelosi was less popular among Americans than Kim Jong-un. Yeah. Now, I'm not a Nancy Pelosi fan, but that's scary. I mean, the other political party, if you're a conservative, shouldn't be the enemy.
Yeah.
They should be people on your team with different views. We're all Americans first, and you should be your party second, in my opinion. So when a lot of conservatives say that they like Kim Jong-un more than Nancy Pelosi, the way you have to think about that from my standpoint is, so how would you feel if we had to go to war with North Korea? If you feel as though Nancy Pelosi is a bigger threat than North Korea, how would you feel about a war? And those are the things on the national level that our government has to be very worried about. If you follow the media, you'll find that every time we're kind of gearing up for an armed conflict, it comes with a slew of news stories, a slew of press releases, and a concerted narrative that tries to paint the picture of the other nation being the bad guy and America needing to step in and be the good guy. This may often be the case, but that doesn't mean that they don't have to push that narrative to make sure you feel that way. And it's important to note, pushing a narrative, propaganda, isn't in itself a nefarious act, right? There are good narratives and bad actor narratives. America, I'd argue, has gotten really bad on the national level of pushing good actor narratives. We just kind of respond to bad actor ones. But on the political front, we've gotten very good at creating narratives to tear each other apart. But a lot of that sprouts from the Russian effort in 2016. While most of it may have indeed been going towards trying to help Donald Trump get elected, there was lots of it that was just about instilling racial discord, purchasing paid ads, publishing fake news outlets. These things have all been tied to the Kremlin in recent years. And these efforts were all pointed not towards one party or the other, but rather towards getting Americans to fight with each other.
But Americans then turn it into, this two-party battle. And you're bringing up an excellent point that, that I don't think a lot of people talk about. And that is the fact that It's not about the candidate that they got elected or that they were trying to get elected. It was the fact that they could do it in the first place. Am I understanding you right?
Absolutely. I mean, it pays to pay attention to. A lot of conservatives especially say, you're not going to be able to manipulate me. I'm offended at the idea that you think that you could influence me. And I understand, your knee-jerk reaction is that it kind of feels like someone's calling you stupid, right? The truth is that these perception management techniques work on the intelligent and the stupid alike. We don't take offense when someone suggests that marketing campaigns work,
Yeah.
No one would argue that marketing and advertising doesn't work. In the United States, we devote billions of dollars a year to concerted influence efforts that are aimed at trying to get you to buy Tylenol versus aspirin, that are aimed at trying to get you to buy Clorox versus Tide. Nobody would dispute that an effective advertising campaign can drive sales. But for some reason, we all want to argue that an effective advertising campaign could drive votes. It's obviously effective. It definitely works. It's the basis of our campaign system. So when foreign nations get involved, the reason why we need to be concerned is because I tend to try not to ascribe to the idea of good guys and bad guys on the national level when it comes to geopolitics. We're all bad guys to a certain extent because we're all self-serving. We need to be. Right? The world's only got so many resources. It's only got so much space, and everybody wants as much of it as we can get. So the United States, I may see as the good guy, playing the home field advantage. But in China, they're the good guy to them, right? The United States and China are in direct competition with one another. And the reason why I refer to these things as a war is because the conflict has been continuous. We're trying to avoid the conflict turning kinetic. We don't want to actually go to war with guns and missiles against China. It's feasible that could happen. I'd argue if it would be 75 to 100 years from now.
Yeah.
But there's a much more feasible chance that China wins this war without ever firing a shot. China could usurp the United States as the dominant diplomatic, economic, and military power in the world gradually through things like influence, coupled with a huge investment into their navy, a huge investment into restructuring their military. One way that you could easily see this is actually in Marvel movies, of all things. The Chinese box office is a huge market. However, unlike the United States, in the United States, we use a rating system that's established by the MPAA. That's not a government agency. It may be corrupt. I could, harp about how crappy the MPAA is. But ultimately, a film there's no legal obligation to get a rating from them. It'll be tougher to get it in theaters without one, but there's no legal requirement. China doesn't work that way. To have a movie released in China, it needs to pass through government censors. The government censors really hold the keys to the city. When you watch, a lot of these latest action movies that performed poorly in the United States but still netted $1 billion, just about anything Dwayne Johnson's been in for the last year, the Transformers franchise, these movies get most of their money overseas. So when they go to the Chinese censors and they say, here's the movie, we would like to release it, the Chinese censors can kick the film back and say, we're not going to release it in our markets because it depicts China as such and such. Some examples would be the ancient one in Doctor Strange is traditionally a Tibetan character. Marvel took a lot of flack for whitewashing that character by casting a white lady to play her. The truth is that they couldn't get it released in a Chinese market with a Tibetan main character.
Wow.
The same thing happened in Iron Man, I think it was 2, when they had the Mandarin, also traditionally a Chinese villain. They had him played by Sir Ben Kingsley for the same reason. China wasn't going to allow the film to be released, so we needed to change the movie's plot to paint China in a better light, or at least make sure we don't paint them in a negative one. In a recent Mission Impossible movie, they said they wouldn't release it in their markets because it showed clotheslines on top of skyscrapers in Beijing.
Wow. That's insane. Now, is this all a psychological warfare battlefield? Both.
It 100% is. What we're looking at is China intentionally framing the way that they can be perceived by American and global audiences. Hollywood's got a far reach, right? So it's not just about making sure that there's an elaborate propaganda infrastructure within China itself that they need to maintain, but they also need to maintain that propaganda infrastructure externally. They tried to invest $20 billion into Paramount Pictures a few years ago. The deal didn't end up going through, But you have to wonder, when a state-owned company is trying to invest $20 billion into one of the biggest movie makers in the United States, there's a reason for that.
Yeah. And so obviously, if they're kicking the movies back and they're not distributing them, in the end, either the movie's changed or future movies are changed, which then changes the perception here in America to things abroad.
Absolutely.
And so
one of the most grievous examples I can think of is the Red Dawn remake, which I was very disappointed with. I loved Red Dawn as a kid. But in the remake, they actually filmed that entire movie with China as the antagonist. But when they realized China wouldn't let them release it in their market, and they didn't feel as though they had a strong enough film to recoup their investment in the domestic market, they went back in and used CGI to change every flag to a North Korean one.
Wow. That's incredible. And the amount of money to do just that.
Exactly. The amount of money that they invested to appeasing the Chinese government really can't be ignored. That's a big deal, you know? And what you end up with is, when you have a generation of Americans growing up with these movies, you have a generation of Americans that don't have overt messaging telling them that China is good, or that it's an economic powerhouse, or that it's a military powerhouse. But you have a generation of Americans who are grown up with these kind of subversive messages telling you that, you know? That's why I think China, as far as propaganda goes, is a bigger threat than Russia. Russia looks and acts like a bad guy. You know, it tends to be pretty easy to pick bad guys out of a crowd. China doesn't. China disguises their narrative efforts in bags of money. And people tend to accept bags of money, even when it comes with some caveats. And that's what we're looking at. And to give you an example of how this kind of perception management technique can really affect real change, the idea that diamond rings as something that you exchange when you get engaged really only dates back to like the 1930s. It was a De Beers marketing campaign that convinced us that diamond rings are how you get engaged and how you get married. It's a relatively new development. Now they're actually launching that same campaign in China as of about the last 10 years. And if you go and look through the De Beers financial release, their press releases, you'll find actual analysis work based on their efforts to convince people you need a diamond to get married, and the success they've had thereafter. First in the United States, then Europe, and now in Asia. The idea that women need to shave their legs and armpits is kind of a post-World War I, World War II era idea. Again, it was a marketing campaign. You know, the way that we see the world really is shaped by concerted efforts to manipulate the way we see one another. You know, often it's marketing. Often, however, it's propaganda. You know, if you've ever met somebody who thinks eating carrots will help with their vision or improve their night vision, that is 100% the product of a World War II era British propaganda campaign. You know, in World War II, the Brits were the first guys to have aircraft mounted radar, right? And World War II was the first conflict that we ever needed to fight wars in the sky at night. And I bet you've come across plenty regarding Foo Fighters in this same period of time, because these Brits and eventually American pilots as well were trying to engage with German bombers that were crossing the channel under cover of darkness. I can only imagine it would be very difficult as the first military aviators in history trying to fly night ops to really be able to tell what the hell is going on up there.
Yeah.
You know? So once they invented this nose-mounted radar, all of a sudden these UK pilots had a very high kill rate when it came to German bombers. They didn't want Germany to know why, because as soon as Germany knows what tool they're using, they're going to start developing a means to counter it.
Yeah.
So instead, they started a huge propaganda campaign that argued that it was British carrots is why these UK pilots are so adept at night combat operations. It's because they eat lots of carrots, and the carrots, you know, they do a vitamin B12, which if you have a deficiency it will hurt your vision. So eating carrots, you know, will cure that the same way limes will cure scurvy, but it's certainly not going to give you night vision. But still to this day, you know, mothers tell their kids, you know, eat your carrots, it's good for your eyes. All because we were trying to make sure the Nazis didn't know we had radar in our aircraft.
How far back in your research does this go, where there's that psychological injection of those types of things? I mean, obviously, when you're talking about
it goes all the way back to the formation of language in early society.
Yeah.
You know, as long as there's been leadership, there's been a need to frame messaging to benefit that leadership.
But
right?
from a military standpoint as well, I mean, obviously, this is playing a role into shaping global politics. It goes well beyond just eating carrots and marketing campaigns and selling diamond rings. I mean, do you feel that from a strategic, political, global standpoint, it goes back that far?
I do. Here's a great example that you can't prove, but it's one of my favorites. The phantom time hypothesis. This idea that I couldn't give you the exact dates off the top of my head. I've read about it a long time ago. But this idea that like 150-year window of what we commonly accept as Western history may have been fabricated by the Pope, and I think it was Charlemagne or maybe another prominent world leader at the time. The idea was effectively that there were only so many people that were literate in the Western world during this period of time. You could very easily say, hey, tomorrow it's 12:13 instead of 11:14. The Catholic Church has done this since on shorter periods of time to correct for issues with the calendar. They've just said, okay, we're skipping a week. Tomorrow is actually next Wednesday. The idea was that you could absolutely fabricate a period of Western history as long as you controlled enough of the literate population. If only 10% of the population can read and write, and you control 8 of that 10%, you can have them all write the same history that you want. And now archaeologists and historians, they tend to put together our distant past through 1, maybe 2. If you're really lucky, you might find 4 or 5 historical records that all kind of jive with one another. So if only 4 or 5 records survive and you control 80% of the literate population of the Western world, you can effectively say history is whatever you want it to be. We've been doing this all along. It's George Washington, kind of the cult of George Washington. I'm a patriot. I love my country. That's why I enlisted. But I still have to look at these things objectively. We have deified George Washington in the United States and kind of sapped the humanity from the man because we need him to be this greater than man entity, right? I cannot tell a lie. This idea that George Washington was an infallible idealist. He was a guy. Guys screw up, guys make mistakes, everybody's got things about them that, maybe you wouldn't necessarily like. He was a guy, a real human person. But we frame our messages for very intentional reasons. Framing the messaging around George Washington at the time was important because we were really worried about our 13 colonies, our new nation, going to war with one another. Under the Articles of Confederacy that predated the Constitution, we were really like a loosely affiliated group of regions, more so than a unified nation. They needed a guy like George Washington to be greater than what he was, to act as a unifying principle, because we didn't have a joint history to bind us yet. Further on down the road, when you think in terms of conflict, the Cold War, both America and the Soviet Union had significant propaganda campaigns aimed at not just influencing their own populations, but influencing the populations of the other nation, right? The idea, again, being to try to encourage you to think that a war with us is a lost cause. In America, though, a lot of the propaganda aimed at us, from us, was based on the idea that the Soviet Union was further along than they were, because it justified the expenditures on, huge weapons programs that ultimately did secure the victory in the Cold War and ultimately did position us well for the 21st century. But we went about it in a pretty dishonest way. We've always done it. Everybody who's had something to lose has always had an interest in making sure messaging is tailored to benefit them.
Yeah.
In today's world, it's more dangerous than ever, only because of how easy it is to gain access to people's heads. It's easy to find people on Facebook. It's easy to manipulate people because, if you click on my Facebook profile right now, you can see the list of pages that I've liked. And from that, Facebook creates, I'm not sure if you've seen this before, but if you dig deep enough into your Facebook settings, you can find that it attributes a political party to you.
Yes, I've seen that. It's a pretty interesting but fairly unknown aspect of Facebook, and then how they deliver the ads to you, how they market to you. I see posts all the time on my feed where somebody will say, "I was Googling, whatever product, and then I went to Facebook, and there it was. It was in an advertisement." And
absolutely. Using that
scary.
same methodology that we use to sell you stuff, it's really, really easy for national level governments to use that exact same methodology to sell you concepts and ideas.
Who do you think is leading the charge in the world right now on this type? I'm calling it psychological warfare. You may have
it is psychological. It's hybrid warfare is another way I would refer to
warfare, Okay. Who do you think America's leading the charge? China, Russia?
Absolutely not. America, unfortunately, is far, far behind when it comes to this idea. I don't want to take credit for this argument. It actually it came from a think tank called Narrative Strategies, which has done some work with SOCOM on the idea of information warfare. And what they contend is that America has adopted this response to narrative mentality, which is we wait for Russia to say what they're going to say about Syria, and then we repeat Russia's statement and say, but that's not true. And what you really do when you do that is you bolster their messaging.
Yeah. So it's more of a defensive stance, waiting for things to respond to versus being aggressive and being the ones that's making the news, essentially.
And you see it firsthand when you see people wearing shirts that's like, I'd rather have Putin than Hillary, and you see, and I don't want to pick on the Conservative Party alone. On the left-hand side, there is just as active a misinformation effort. There's just as active a campaign. It doesn't get quite as much attention in the media, though, But Russia is certainly at the forefront of bang for their buck. Russia's economy couldn't sustain an actual armed conflict with the United States, but Russia's economy can certainly sustain digital efforts. They're at the forefront of doing the most with the least. China, I would argue, are at the forefront of doing the most with the most. China's throwing bags of money at their influence campaigns to great effect. In large part, you can tell how good the effect is that nobody's talking about it. Russia, their efforts aren't quite as good, but Russia benefits from having a massive media infrastructure that they have put together and really managed to trick the United States, a large portion of the populace, into thinking they're legitimate news organizations. RT, TASS, Sputnik, all of these outlets are Russian state-owned outlets that have a very specific bias. But you'll still see them shared on your Facebook news feeds from the buddies
all the time. And one of the most recent articles that you wrote was titled "Russian Media Launches Campaign to Convince You the World is on the Brink of Nuclear War." So obviously you've done a lot of research into Russian media influence and scaring the heck out of the world. What do you, for those who haven't read the article yet, and I recommend you all to do so, tell everyone, what exactly do you mean by that? What are they doing versus what is reality?
So this speaks again to the idea of trying to sow discord within the United States. President Trump's a controversial figure, and as a result of that, you're going to find a certain amount of pushback for any initiative that he's at the forefront of, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, right? So the decision to withdraw from the INF Treaty, which was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, effectively, it bans both Russia and the United States from building cruiser ballistic missiles with ranges between 500 and 1,500 kilometers. The idea really is that if you were to mount missile apparatus in Europe that's got an intermediate or a short range nuclear warhead on it, it would have only a few minutes before it actually made landfall in Russian territory, and Russia wouldn't be able to counter that strike. This is the narrative that Russia's pushing. Because Russia wouldn't have the means to defend against this strike, they would immediately have to launch their own nuclear missiles, and there you have it. We've got nuclear war. They're really pushing this idea that without the INF Treaty, the United States and Europe will put nuclear weapons in Europe, and as a result of which, Russia will have to adopt a strike first or a preemptive strike mentality because they won't have time to respond if we launch short-range missiles at them. That concept doesn't work in practice because mutually assured destruction is based on both nations maintaining a nuclear triad.
Yeah.
America uses bombers, submarines, and land-launched ICBMs. Russia uses the same. So no matter how devastating a first strike could be, if America for some reason decided to launch one, Russia would absolutely be able to launch a counterstrike from at least two of the three legs of their triad. That's the premise of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So mutually assured destruction stands with or without the INF Treaty. If one nuclear weapon is launched at either Russia or the United States, both nations are going to be effectively destroyed, right? It doesn't matter the range of the missile. It doesn't matter the size of the warhead. It doesn't matter where it's launched from. All it takes is one nuke to really set off a nuclear war. However, Russia's well aware of the fact that in the United States, conservative leading media outlets support Donald Trump's decision to pull back from this treaty, and liberal leaning media outlets think it's a terrible idea, right? A lot of times you'll find these pieces aren't necessarily discussing the actual tenets of the INF. You'll find that they're talking Trump, right? As a result of that, this is just one more thing for us to go to war over with each other, instead of us keeping an eye on, I mean, the real reason why we're backing out of the INF treaty, if you ask me, is because China never signed it. 95% of China's ballistic missile stores would violate the INF treaty had they signed it. And America is much more concerned with the threat in the Pacific posed by the Chinese than they are from the Russians. It benefits us to back out of this treaty. We're not talking about that, though. We're talking about whether or not Donald Trump is an idiot, you know? And because we're framing this conversation wrong, thanks in large part to, I mean, you'll see these Russian media outlets, they use what I call a citation chain. What you do is you use their really small independent outlets to write a story that's not really based in good concrete facts. You cite those outlets by some intermediary outlets, some slightly larger regional outlets, who are then cited by slightly larger national level outlets. So by the time these stories reach the Russian international media, sites like RT, what they're doing is they're not saying, hey, we made this story up. They're citing the something or other Gazette that cited the something or other Telegram, that cited the something or other regional press, that cited this one Kremlin-sponsored blog out of Moscow.
Yeah.
But it's really tough to dig back through all those citations to find the source, so we tend to take it at face value.
I call it copy and paste journalism.
Absolutely. I'd be willing to bet that we're looking at maybe a few weeks before stories about, I mean, they're already starting to trickle in, but before stories in the American national media start talking about the threat of nuclear war with Russia, thanks to backing out of the INF treaty.
Now, let me ask you, just for clarity. Now, we were talking about the Russian media pushing that narrative of, you know, you plop these missiles down where they have minutes to respond, and, you know, mutually assured destruction kind of takes over, and they're going to launch prior to even thinking about it. Is there, like, that seems right to me. Are you saying that that's not entirely accurate, or they're trying to scare the, you know, bejeebers out of the entire world population, or are they pushing something that is actually true?
I don't think that it's accurate that they would launch a preemptive strike, only for self-serving reasons.
Okay.
What Russia's biggest problem that they're facing right now is their economy. Aside from being stifled by U.S. and UN sanctions after their annexation of Crimea in 2014, I mean, their infiltration of our electrical grid last year, we put more sanctions on them for that. They have a really stifled economy that wasn't that strong to begin with, right? So what they've been forced to do is reduce defense spending year over year in recent years, but they're really trying hard to get an influx of cash for their defense apparatus by becoming kind of the bad actor weapons distributor. You know, America's got a list of countries we'll sell F-35s to, we'll sell THAAD missile defense systems to, we'll send M4s to. But then there's a long list of, you know, the naughty list, these countries that we won't give F-35s to. Russia wants to position themselves as the nation that caters to that naughty list, right? So in order to do so, they have to make sure they stay in the conversation when it comes to the forefront of military technology. That's why you keep seeing stories about their Su-57, which is their 5th generation fighter. Despite the fact that it doesn't work, they've only got one that actually flies and meets the 5th generation criteria. This is not a threat. The Su-57 is not a threat. You know, Russia's T-14 Armada, which is their new main battle tank, they can't afford to produce those in any viable numbers. Campaign after campaign is showing, I mean, their Uran 6, which is like their infantry robot, they've got a lot of press for their military apparatus, but not a lot of capability. And that's intentional.
Press by Russian media or American media? It
starts with Russian media, and it immediately hits the American media.
Trickles down. I see. So then the media here in America is obviously to blame for a lot of this, you know, taking root and becoming a bigger story than it is, right? I mean, the media is to blame for a lot of this, or no?
The media is to blame, but here's where I'm going to say something pretty unpopular. The media is to blame.
Wait, I love those types of things on this show, so please, I say them all the time.
The media is to blame, but really we are. You know, the American public is to blame. we keep saying we want objective journalism. We keep saying that what we really want is, the truth. But by and large, biased journalism and clickbait is the biggest revenue driver in my industry.
Mm-hmm.
News Rep, who I do a lot more hard-hitting foreign policy analysis for than Fighter Sweep. News Rep's an independent news outlet, which means that we're able to push our luck a little. We have subscribers. We're not a huge outlet like CNN. So I don't really have much in the way of editorial oversight in terms of tone or theme, right? I'm allowed to write about what I think is important to write about. Obviously, I have editors that'll beat me up about language or, make sure that I'm not conveying a bias. But when you see outlets like CNN, which people on the right would contend is very liberal-leaning, and outlets like Fox, which people on the left would contend is very conservative-leaning, the reason why these outlets have a bias is because it's marketable.
Yeah.
These are businesses they're in the business of making money, not making news. And the way to make the most money the fastest is to give people what they want. So when a Russian video gets released by the Kremlin that shows their new hypersonic missile that America's supposed to be really afraid of, the video, there was one released 2 weeks ago. The video shows the missile being launched and flying through the air and nothing else, because there's very little evidence to substantiate the idea that they have a legitimate targeting apparatus for a missile that moves at that velocity. They don't show that stuff. They just look at this missile flying, release a press release, it hits the media. 2 days later, it's in, Newsweek. Here's Russia's newest hypersonic missile that I hate to say it because I write for Popular Mechanics. Popular Mechanics had a headline 2 days ago. It was like, Russia tests their new, nuclear-powered cruise missile with unlimited range. The headline didn't point out that in 13 tests, the nuclear-powered propulsion system has failed to fire every time. The missile has never been viable. It likely never will be. And if it is, it still won't do them any good. The headline still reads, Doomsday Missile. Because that's what sells. And as long as people are going to click on things because they elicit an emotional reaction, because it evokes outrage, or because it supports their pre-existing views, when we click on those stories, when we share those stories, we're participating in the downfall of good journalism.
You said it wouldn't be popular, but I think you're absolutely right about blaming the people itself. I mean, we see it on social networking all the time, and I'm curious to your thoughts on how powerful of a tool that is in this war. But we see it all the time where people, I would venture a bet that a high 75 to 95%, if not higher, of the people that forward, share, like, and say, look at this and so on, never even go beyond the headline. So they never even read the article. They're just copying and links and, pasting and sharing and forwarding, but never reading the actual content of the article itself. So I'm with you there. I mean, I think you nailed it. And I think that should be a very popular thing to say, because the general public is they're not researching anymore. And I remember a few years back, there was I don't remember if it was an April Fool's thing or it was just a psychological experiment where a company put out a really catchy, flashy headline that was somewhat believable, but it was over the top. If you click on it, the first line is, this is not true. It's a psychological experiment. Don't like it. Don't share it. Don't comment on it. Just know that, you're one of the small percentage that actually reads this thing. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what it was. And you see all these people that are commenting these ridiculously stupid comments based on the headline. And clearly people don't read what they're forwarding around. So that's my rant, but I see it all the time. So how powerful then is the tool? Obviously, a media is culpable here, but what about social networking as a whole? Because we see comments and posts all the time. Is that a pretty powerful tool in this?
It absolutely is. This speaks to the heart of perception and narrative campaigns. If you want someone to buy into your narrative, you need to engage with their sense of identity, right? Their sense of self. This is why it works so well in the realm of politics, because increasingly in the United States, people tend to identify with their parties. And as a result, you might not even agree with everything on the ticket for your particular political party. But it's more important to you that you win this fight for your team than it necessarily is that, we pay attention to the best ideas, the ways to move forward, right? So because we have really gotten this idea that our political party, our team, provides us with this sense of identity, it's easy to tailor messages that cater to that, right? And I'll give you two, a domestic and a foreign hypothetical situations of how this could really affect something. Domestically, in the UFO community, people are familiar with the idea of disinfo agents, right? Disinformation agents. Like kind of the idea that like this crazy guy is telling everybody that he's been talking to the Pleiadians or whoever it may be. And either he's a part of a government disinformation campaign or his messaging is being bolstered by a government disinformation campaign to kind of discredit the UFO community as a whole, right? We've been using that real methodology to cover, aircraft experimentation for decades.
Yeah.
Area 51 is where we were testing the U-2, Oxcart, which turned into the SR-71 or vice versa. We've been tailoring our messaging to the idea that if you look up in the sky and you see something weird, it means you're crazy for a long time, because that's the easiest way for us to make sure that the stories we share about this unusual aircraft we saw in the sky are dismissed instead of shared with Russian intelligence, or other nations. We don't want people to know that we're operating with the F-117 in 1991, right? We didn't want the world to know that yet. So when people saw a black triangle in the sky, same thing with the B-2 and now with the B-21 Raider, you see a black triangle in the sky, it's easier to say you're crazy than it is to really dig into it when you know for a fact that it was your black triangle.
Yeah.
And
there's been a lot, not to jump in, but there's been a lot of research done by this, officially acknowledged by the United States government, namely the CIA. I don't know if you've done research on this. There's not much known about it. But there was something called Operation Mockingbird by the CIA they believe about the early 1950s. In short, I've gone after declassified documents on this. There's only one real reference to it. It was in what the CIA calls the Family Jewels Collection. I had talked about that on this program quite a few episodes ago in the TBV Unredacted segment. But in that Family Jewels Collection, what they called the Family Jewels was all of the secrets of the CIA. Mockingbird was described in this document, it's the only reference I can find, as a research effort by the CIA to essentially infiltrate and then manipulate American media news outlets. Absolutely. And they were controlling the narrative. So a lot of this is not far-fetched and goes back to the 1950s. And my whole point about pointing out that there's not a whole lot of information there, they cover it up. That's how powerful of a tool this is, that the CIA would do this type of research. They probably were successful in it, infiltrated the media, controlled the message, and then deleted the evidence that they ever did it. At least I can't find anything. Are there other examples out there that you know of officially acknowledged research by the military or government?
I can't name one off the top of my head, but I can tell you that, military public affairs, government public affairs offices, that's really what their job is, right? Their job is to frame stories in a way that will paint the United States military or the United States government in the best light possible. A personal example I have of that is on one deployment that I went on to Africa years ago. I was part of the advance party. There's only 12 Marines that landed there, for the first couple of days before we had, 1,000 Marines and other services come in and land soon thereafter once we had cleared some territory. While we were there for a number of reasons. We were there as a show of force because there's a growing Islamic extremism influence in Southern Africa. So it was certainly a show of force. It was also there for humanitarian outreach. All the public affairs stories that were shared that my wife was following while I was home, that my parents were reading, because where we were, we're not talking about the type of deployment where there's buildings already there so I can go to the computer terminal and write an email back to my wife. We're in the middle of the African savannah just trying to get our walkie-talkies to work, and comms are never up in the field. But so while we're out there, things were going poorly. Our airdrop missed us by 50 miles. Our resupply convoy didn't come. We went for 3 days without food or water. Meanwhile, my wife is getting these stories about how her husband and the group of Marines that are with him are helping these dentists treat, the local indigenous population. There certainly were Marines there working as security for dentists that were working with the Marines or with the African population. but it wasn't us. That's my operation wasn't classified. That mission wasn't some kind of deep, dark, dirty secret.
Mm-hmm.
But PAO still needed to make sure that they framed the messaging in a way that showed, look at the Marines doing good things in Africa. Meanwhile, me and my guys were trying to clear territory on our second day without water using hand axes so that we could get some airplanes to land, some Ospreys to come in and bring us some stuff. Every message you get, whether it's from the government or not, has an intent. Now, a lot of objective journalists would argue that their messaging, the intent is objective journalism, but even bias exists even when you don't mean for it to be there, right? I mean, you have your natural inclinations, and it's tough sometimes to weed those out. That's why good editors are so important, because they can point that out to you. But this effort is long-standing. It doesn't stop. You and I had a conversation on Twitter not that long ago about the Defense Department's efforts to investigate UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I had slightly different angles to the same conclusion, which was effectively these efforts don't stop. They just might not be housed under the same administrative guidelines, but someone's still going to look into that thing. Someone's still going to look into this thing. Programs will continue, but this is dead. That's really what we're seeing when it comes to perception management as well. America is reluctant to acknowledge the fact that we would engage in such a thing because it seems nefarious, but it's definitely ever present. When you work with a public affairs officer as a journalist, you need to understand that what they're telling you is probably bullshit. I'm sorry if I...
No, that's okay. I'll put an explicit warning. You're fine.
You need to understand that it's the same thing as calling the CEO of a company and asking them for a comment, right? It's advertising, it's marketing.
Yeah.
But a lot of what we get in the media, a lot of what you'll see on CNN or the Wall Street Journal is a repackaging of the messages that we were given by the Defense Department. In the recent episode, I hate to admit it, I forgot her name, but about DARPA.
With Annie Jacobson, yeah.
Annie Jacobson discussed some things a lot like this, where the initiatives don't necessarily go away. We just find new ways to package them, right? And it's the same thing with this. To go back to my idea of how this could affect foreign policy is, let's say in 30 years from now, the South China Sea sees 1/3 of global commerce over the surface of that body of water. That's huge.
Mm-hmm.
The global economy is reliant on free travel through the South China Sea. China has claimed sovereignty over the entirety of the South China Sea, which extends thousands of miles beyond their own shores. Traditionally, every nation has an economic exclusion zone that extends 250 miles from their shores. So China's claim overlaps the claims of a number of different nations and international waters that these commerce ships would use to traverse, for moving cargo from China or to elsewhere. In, let's say, 30 to 50 years from now, China's Navy is already massive. Let's say they've decided to start enforcing their sovereignty over the South China Sea. All of a sudden, they have a naval blockade that prevents commerce from going through it unless you pay China a tariff or you make some kind of agreement with them in trade. And that could cripple a huge portion of the American economy. But 50 years from now, the American population has grown up watching movies, watching TV, and seeing the news, painting China in an overwhelmingly positive light. They were the ones trying to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula when America was bullying North Korea's nuclear program.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones that are always saying everybody should just calm down. Meanwhile, they've built and launched 30 new warships in the past 2 years. They don't cover them in their media anymore. And because all Chinese media is owned by the state, we just don't hear about it. If 50 years from now, we need to engage in an armed conflict with China to protect our economic interests, to keep our economy feasible, it's going to be a really tough sell for the American voting public who have spent the last 50 years hearing about how rad China is.
Yeah.
And
who's behind that, the creation of that image? America, China, or both?
China is excellent at PR. Xi Jinping, China's president, is now the president for life in China. They don't play games the same way Russia, although they have frequent elections, the conclusion to the election is determined well beforehand. These guys aren't acting in terms of presidential cycles. Here in the United States, we could have a complete policy shift every 4 to 8 years. In Russia and China, they don't. They play the long game. Xi Jinping knows that subtle influence over 30 years will get you far more than a really hard campaign over 2 years, you know? So they're playing the long game, and we're not equipped to do so. You know, we need to find a way to compete, despite the fact that, you know, our political system, which is, I would argue, superior to the political systems in place in either of those countries, but it does come with drawbacks. One of them being that we can't really mount these long-term initiatives to counter Chinese narratives or Russian narratives because we're changing tack every 4 years. You know,
and they've got to know. Well, obviously they know that, but I mean, they've got to know that is a very important aspect to this war. Where if China can just sit back and wait it out, and they're playing the long game, they know if something's bad over here, then in 4 years or possibly 8, it's going to change and rotate. And I think that probably hinders America, I assume. I'm not advocating for unlimited presidencies, but I mean,
exactly.
I'm guessing that
tough,
hinders.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very tough situation.
The tough part about looking at these things objectively is that sometimes your conclusions aren't things that you agree with, right? Yeah. And like, for instance, you know, I think Winston Churchill said democracy is the best form of government aside from, or it's the only good one because all the rest are terrible, right? Something along those lines. Paraphrase, effectively, democracy is a flawed system. Our method of democracy even more so. You know, it's a republic more so than a democracy, but it still beats the alternative. But that doesn't mean there aren't drawbacks. That doesn't mean that we don't have chinks in our armor, you know, weak points that we need to address because of our form of government, because of the way that we manage these, you know, our foreign policy practices.
But you're saying America is missing the boat on that. Do you feel that on the horizon there will be changes to try and counter this, to try and be a little bit stronger on this you know, hybrid warfare front? Or do you think
it's tough because America has proven to be really bad at messaging? You know, Donald Trump, when he ran for president, what a lot of people thought Donald Trump would really bring to the presidency was a snaz for branding, right? Yeah. This guy would be able to market initiatives. He's proven to not be that effective at doing that. But what we need is we would need a U.S. government that found a way to package such an initiative in a way that wouldn't get us all to start screaming at him in the streets, you know? And it's tough to advance a narrative without being painted as a bad guy by your own free press. Russia and China don't have that disadvantage. They don't have a free press to criticize their endeavors. So here in the United States, you know, one of the things that protects us is our free press, but it's also one of the things that can hinder our efforts to kind of frame our messages in a way that benefits the United States to the detriment of national level opponents. You know,
but despite being a free press, it sounds like you're on the mindset that the majority, not everybody, but the majority of media outlets are skewed anyway. So free press, sure, but I mean, if they're framing these types of stories in ways that just aren't reality, can we get out of this? I mean,
therein lies the real. That's the real fear, right? You know, when we're talking about, you know, Russia's efforts to stay prominent as a military power in the world, at least via the headlines, has been bolstered directly by the American media. You know, the American media is eager to share stories about Russia's, you know, their statistics, Poseidon doomsday weapon. You know, they're eager to share stories about advancements with their 5th generation fighter programs or their artillery, which admittedly does have a greater range than American artillery. We're eager to share these stories because there's 2 reasons. One, if I'm, you know, you'll have a defense policy analyst or a defense technology analyst writing a story that's breaking down a capability gap. You know, China's hypersonic anti-ship missiles represent a legitimate capability gap for the United States Navy. So you try to paint that picture without necessarily trying to convince people that China would dominate us in a war right now. They wouldn't, but that doesn't mean this isn't a concern, right? So then you've got the other school of thought, though, and I don't want to name names of outlets, but there are plenty of large and mainstream outlets you'll find that tout this doomsday line, this idea that Russia's new fighters are the most capable and advanced in the world, and they may well be able to shoot down America's F-35s. You know, China's new submarines are so stealthy, we won't be able to detect them coming. There may be some truth to this, but the way that we frame it paints this kind of terrifying Armageddon picture because Armageddon sells. And the reason why that's dangerous is because it gives the American people this concept, this skewed idea of the geopolitical world the skewed idea of America's military and of the military powers of other nations. And because of that, it makes it really difficult to make informed decisions about what you really think about American foreign policy. You know, when in the Washington Post, one day you'll read an article about Donald Trump being a Russian state actor, and the next one you'll read a story about how he's trying to start a new nuclear arms race with Russia. Because we're framing our stories in terms of it is only the world's going to end. We're just looking for the reason. We're really doing ourselves a disservice when it comes to trying to manage actually developing conflicts.
Yeah. It's amazing when you really look at over, let's say, a year period, especially this day and age, a year period of the headlines on the same topic from the same newspaper. You see this wildly different array of angles on the story, of accusations, of claims. And I'm not trying to say, Trump is innocent or Obama's innocent
me neither.
or whatever.
For all I know, he may well be guilty. But
yeah, exactly. But I mean, when you do look at over time what the media is feeding you, it really is just makes everything confusing because you don't know what or whom to believe.
So what do people tend to do? This is a part of the Russian disinformation apparatus. It's a procedure for them. If you flood people with information, especially contradictory information, by and large, people tend to resort to confirmation bias. If I'm overwhelmed by the information at hand, I'm going to stick with the information I like.
Wow.
So when you release 60 stories about the same topic over the course of a week, those 60 stories all present a very different angle as to how it'll affect the world at large, your personal life, the government, the president, what have you. As soon as you start to feel overwhelmed, you're going to go back to your comfort zone. And your comfort zone for a lot of people tends to be outlets that share their values and ideologies. For a conservative, it might be Breitbart. For a liberal, it might be, whatever the equivalent is on the other side. The idea being, I'm going to go back to the guy I trust to tell me what's going on. Russia uses this methodology all the time by having 16 different government mouthpieces say different things within 2 days. When we launched missile strikes in Syria against, some structures that were tied to Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons, the Russian government immediately said, we intercepted, 88 out of the 103 missiles that were launched. That is objectively untrue. You can confirm it with satellite images, from commercial and government satellite images. There is no basis for the idea that Russian anti-missile defenses worked that effectively or were even engaged at all. But Russia knows Americans aren't going to go look at the satellite images.
Yeah.
Russia knows very well that Americans aren't going to even Google it. They're going to see the headlines that say Kremlin states 88 of 103 missiles were intercepted. Russian S-400 anti-missile defense systems are amazing. You're going to scroll past that. You're going to maybe process it consciously, maybe not, maybe subconsciously. 3 weeks later, you're going to hear something about Russian missile defenses, and you're going to think they're pretty viable. That's called source amnesia. I know that a giraffe's tongue is black, but I don't remember where I learned it.
Wow.
This technique is very effective. It works. We use it on other countries. We use it on ourselves. The idea is basically that all you really need to do is get some headlines out there that say what you want them to say. The content of the story, as you pointed out, doesn't need to support the headline directly.
Yeah.
All you need is to plant that seed in people's minds and then allow it to germinate over time, And the future of warfare starts with PR. We need to convince Americans that an armed conflict is worth getting into. You saw it with the buildup for a potential conflict with North Korea. There was a flood of news stories and releases about the terrible conditions in North Korea, about their work camps, about the way Kim Jong-un treats his people. Americans, by and large, didn't care about how Kim Jong-un treated his people right before that. But what we needed to do was sell the world on the idea that we're going to go in there as liberators if we have to go in there.
And just solidify the idea.
Exactly. Because we can't just declare war without convincing the American people that we should. As we've seen time and time again, if the American people turn on a conflict, the conflict's not going to go well for the United States.
So I have to ask, other than fighter, as we approach the end here, and I could ask you questions all day long.
I'm having a blast.
Same here. Other than fightersweep.com, other than the newsrep.com, what sources out there do you trust?
Now, I want to be careful here when I say this. I think that it's important that when you go to NewsRep and when you go to Fighter Sweep, you should use the same critical eye you use with these outlets as you should anywhere else. When you're reading my work, I'd like you to be critical of it. When you're reading the work of my peers, I'd like you to be critical of it. There are some great outlets out there, but it's important to remember that a great outlet can have bad journalists, and great journalists can work at a bad outlet, right? So you may get some real heavy bias on a story on CNN, but the next day you may find a very well put together objective piece on something else. I would say Reuters is an excellent place for you to get international news. The BBC is also a pretty solid place to get a lot of international news. It's not necessarily the best place to get European Union news, not necessarily the best place to get Brexit news, because they've got a dog in that fight. But if you can find news outlets that are one step removed from the issue at hand, if you want to learn more about American national politics, it might benefit you to refer to the BBC. If you want to learn more about a potential conflict between China and the United States, it might benefit you to read maybe not necessarily a Japanese publication because they have a dog in that fight as well. But, find somebody who isn't trying to advance a narrative to benefit anyone. So it takes some active searching.
Yeah.
But I would argue,
does such a thing exist?
Yeah. It's easier for me to say, oh, do some active searching because it's what I do for a living. I research for a living. It's tougher for, someone with 3 kids and a full-time job, and they got to get, Susan to soccer practice, and they still need to wash the dishes. They still need to make dinner. There's still 2 loads of laundry to do. And they catch 5 minutes of the news, while they eat dinner. It's really hard for me to tell that person, you need to go do some research about this.
Yeah.
This is the problem that a lot of Americans face. They're not intentionally misinformed. They're busy.
Yeah. And I think that those that do have a couple of minutes, I want to be a little bit fair and give people some credit. And even though this may come off as demeaning and being rude, I don't mean it to be, but I think some people out there have the time and want to have the time, but they don't know how to research because we are so inundated by biased sources and slanted media and so on.
100%. I agree with you completely.
It's very hard to get to the truth. And that's why I wanted to ask you, what sources out there do you kind of go for? But then the question is, do any of them have the reliability where we can go to them every day and say,
I would tell you,
this is gospel.
And this might just be my crazy asshole paranoia, but I would tell you, I would unequivocally trust no outlet. When you look for toned language, and when I say toned language, I mean the most dangerous type of bias you'll run into in journalism is inferred bias, which is word choices that aren't necessarily non-factual, but have a connotation, right? You'll see it a lot of time in headlines. It's supposed to be a factual headline, but they'll use a word, they'll use a word that refers to being crazy, or they'll use a word that refers to violence, or within the piece, you'll find adjectives or descriptive words that, kind of touch the fence of objectivity and subjectivity. And what these journalists are really trying to do is they're trying to persuade you without doing it directly. The better the writer, the more dangerous the bias, So if you have a really capable, really competent writer who's been writing for the New York Times for 30 years, it's pretty easy for him to persuade you without you noticing.
Yeah.
So you got to look for that persuasive language. When you spot that persuasive language, it doesn't mean throw the piece away. It doesn't mean that, oh, well, this is garbage, but it means be a little more critical. Look for the motive behind anything that you're given, whether it's a national level motive or regional level motive, or just a political or a specific outlet's motive. Bear in mind that almost every piece of content you find online, someone got paid to write.
Yeah.
And if someone's paying for it, there's a reason. And that reason isn't just to inform.
Yeah, there's a lot of ulterior motives there. Let me ask you one last question, and then I know I got to let you go. Your book, The Perception Wars, How Influence Shapes Conflict. Obviously, you deal with a lot of these topics, and that you have taught me an awful lot in the last hour. The show exceeded my expectations because, like I said in the beginning, I really don't know a whole lot about this topic, so it was great to pick your brain a little bit. My last
I gotta say, man, after listening to a few of your other shows, I was worried that I wouldn't be able to stand up to some of the other folks you've had on here. So I'm happy to hear it.
No, you absolutely did, and I appreciate the information. So again, the perception wars: how influence shapes conflict. Let me ask you one last question, and just a sentence or two. For those who do choose to read the book, which I highly recommend everybody to do, what do you want them to walk away with after they do so?
I want you to walk away with a verging on paranoia perspective of concerted messaging efforts, whether they're through the media or governments. I want you to walk away worried about what they're trying to sell you. When you see an advertisement on TV, you know they're trying to sell you Clorox bleach. When you see a press release from a foreign government, or you see quotes from foreign governments in news stories, that's the same thing. I want you to start looking at media and national level messaging the same way you look at Super Bowl commercials. What is it that they're trying to sell me? As long as you maintain that mindset, it's a lot more difficult for them to sell you on something that you don't believe in personally.
Well, I'm really glad you didn't just answer that with "we're screwed," because that would have really made my day a lot worse.
I hope we're not screwed, because I want to write another book.
Good. So. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to that. You are welcome back anytime. Again, the perception wars: how influence shapes conflict. I am going to link everything in the show notes. For those who don't know how to get there, go to www.theblackvault.com/show notes. I'm going to break down Alex's Twitter, Facebook, so you can follow him there. Here's just a couple headlines on proving my point on why you should follow him. The Navy's sub-hunting drone ship sailed all the way to Hawaii without a crew. Another one of Alex's articles: Air Force F-35's close air support gun doesn't work and only 60% of delivered jets fly. Another one: U-2 spy plane flies over California using the aviation code for Star Trek's USS Enterprise. And those are just articles from like the last week. So definitely follow Alex. He has material that's right up all of our alley. Really do appreciate your time, Alex. Thank you so much for joining me here on the Black Vault Radio.
It's been a real pleasure, man. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you. Although that concludes my interview with Alex Hollings, don't go away. Coming up, I'll stick with the theme of this episode and pull a document that details some of the ways the United States military is controlling the narrative in other countries without ever firing a bullet. In this episode's TBV Unredacted, I want to talk about a document and then more of the topic as a whole. But specifically, this was a document that was created in May of 2000 that I received under the Freedom of Information Act. This is part of the psychological operations category on the Black Vault, something that after this episode I want to expand quite a bit, because obviously PSYOPs and psychological operations have been around for quite some time. There's not a whole lot of focus by not only myself, but really the mainstream media and reporting and journalists. They're not reporting on that psychological aspect or psychological warfare aspect to the grander picture that when you get into politics. They're stuck on whether or not, and Mr. Hollings pointed this out, on whether or not, quote unquote, Donald Trump is an idiot versus the root of what's causing that story, and that is the Russian infiltration and manipulation of a United States election. Now, people politicize that, and they make it about Republicans versus Democrats, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, so on and so forth, but they're not looking deeper. And Alex brought up a very interesting point about the fact that it wasn't that Russians necessarily wanted Donald Trump in the White House. They wanted the American people to know that they can do it in the first place. And that was an amazing part of Alex's interview that I was fascinated by, because we don't hear about that. So it made me dig into the archive a little bit, and this May 2000 document is called The Creation and Dissemination of All Forms of Information in Support of Psychological Operations, or PSYOPs, in Time of Military Conflict. This report, which was put together by the Defense Science Board Task Force, it actually researched the PSYOPs during a military conflict and what we can or can't do as the United States military. Now, I've gone after quite a few different documents. I'm profiling this one because this is let me see how many pages this is. This is a fairly large document. There are 63 pages in this particular one, but there are multiple reports that you can download. But this one goes extensively into the capabilities of what we can and can't do, how we can broadcast using pamphlets and using the internet, wireless internet specifically. Now, that was obviously in the year 2000 was, kind of still unfolding. Even though wireless existed, it was not what it was today. So it was talking about all the forms of psychological operations. But one that fascinates me, and you really don't hear about it that much, is the fact that the United States military in these areas of conflict, where I first learned about it, it actually stretches back to the beginning stages of our invasion of Iraq. What we were doing was, in addition to dropping bombs, planes were flying over and literally chucking pamphlets out of the window and out of the cargo bays of these aircraft to essentially blanket these cities with messages. They were trying to, as Alex pointed out throughout the interview I had with him, on multiple levels, essentially control the narrative, control what the people were hearing, seeing, reading, and what their perception was of the media. Why this is interesting and why it plays a role into this episode is the fact that obviously Iraqi television, those select few media outlets that were broadcasting to the Iraqi people, were telling everyone, well, Americans are the devil, they're the enemy, that they are the evil of the planet, and they are there invading and trying to essentially take over their country. Obviously, that was a very skewed and biased slant to what was really going on. Well, these psychological operations that were underway by our United States military was literally blanking the cities with messages, pamphlets that people literally would pick up off the street, off their front yards, wherever they would land, and see the message that then America wanted to convey to the Iraqi people. Now, of course, we hope that these were accurate messages. We hope that we were being honest with the Iraqi people and why we were there. But essentially, we don't know. I mean, we know some of the flyers that went and some of the messages, but take into account on how powerful that really is. That we can go into these countries, and we're blessed here in America where we have multiple, biased or not, we have multiple media outlets we can watch. We can essentially pick and choose, like Alex pointed out, which ones we want to believe and which ones we don't. We also have essentially free access to the internet. We can go anywhere we want, anytime we want. But in other countries like Iraq, they don't have many options. They may not have the technological infrastructure to just log on to the internet and see what's going on. So all of a sudden, those pamphlets become incredibly powerful to the message of America, to the Iraqi people, but on top of that, become a very powerful, possibly destructive weapon in the overall battle, in the overall war. So this document that I'm pointing out, and again, there are many, many you can download, I'm just picking one, gives recommendations on what the military can do at times of conflict for these psychological operations. And it gives a list of quite a few recommendations on what they can do, but essentially creating a special unit just for this, just to specialize in these psychological operations. So I did a little bit of research. I'll link over to, this is a Washington Post article, fairly interesting. I don't like, in this particular segment, to link over to media articles that often. I try to primarily, stick with the documents itself, the documents themselves. But this particular article talks about, in 2015, the pamphlets that we were dropping on Syria. So the ones that I was just talking about in Iraq go back to about 2002. Syria, they were doing this in 2015, and they were dropping very graphic propaganda leaflets to the Syrian people. Again, with that message, trying to control the narrative. And you'll see, because the Washington Post did obtain one of these pamphlets, it is incredibly graphic. I mean, it's awful. This obvious jihadist, terrorist-looking guy that is wearing, all dark gray, face masked, is literally throwing a human being into like a meat processor kind of thing, and he's grinding him literally to hamburger meat. It's graphic just to hear it. When you see it, it's pretty awful. But obviously, the American military were dropping these leaflets along with many others. And this Washington Post article not only shows that, but actually shows some other photographs. One from 2008. This was from the U.S. Army's 350th Tactical PSYOPs Division. They were literally chucking these pamphlets out of the side of their helicopter. Another photograph they show, this was a training exercise in 2005, an F-18 Super Hornet. They were dropping what they call these Payload Delivery Unit 5, PDU-5 canisters. They were filled with these hockey puck pamphlet rolls, and essentially just on a missile type contraption that launches, and then these pucks not explode but disseminate thousands of leaflets as the F-18 flies over a city. Really fascinating technology that you don't hear about. I mean, we hear about the news that goes boom and explosions and death and destruction. We don't really hear a whole lot about these pamphlets. So I felt maybe this episode was the right way to put in a document about the psychological operations. All of that information is linked at the show notes page. If you don't know how to get there, it's www.theblackvault.com/show notes. You can go ahead and download this document. I'll link over to the Washington Post article. This is episode number 22. So make sure, if this is not the most recent, scroll down to episode 22. You'll have all of those links. Download the document, look at the photos. It's an amazing and very much uncharted area of our capability, and something that, as Alex pointed out and writes about in his book, it is possible that America, the United States, is missing the boat on really defending against this, to not be subjected to the Russians manipulating elections, the Chinese manipulating how Hollywood delivers messages through their movies. It goes beyond a lot of what he was talking about, and the incapable nature that we have right now, or that we don't have, to really defend against this. So it was a great episode. I really want to thank Alex again. Thank you all for listening. Again, www.theblackvault.com/show notes. That'll also have all of the ways that you can subscribe to this radio show, whether it be on iTunes, the Google Play Store, Stitcher, TuneIn, even YouTube. I drop these episodes on there. Make sure you subscribe because it is one of the only ways you're going to be able to get updated on when these shows drop. So this is John Greenewald Jr. signing off. We'll see you next time.